want to start off this discussion on aggregate and disaggregate data with an extreme example. This is related to a parachute trial that was conducted in 2018. Take a moment and digest the conclusion. You'll see here that the researchers' conclusion, after having individuals jump from an aircraft with a parachute and an empty backpack, came to the conclusion that parachutes didn't reduce death or traumatic injury. The study was published in 2018 after several peer reviews. It's an extreme example because I'm sure none of us would jump from an aircraft with an empty backpack. But the study represents the type of data we're faced with dealing with every day as we look to expedite analysis and drive toward desired outcomes. What we learn, however, is that what appear to be empirical results can easily be misused and result in misguided inference. Next slide, please. You see, what wasn't disclosed is that jumping from the aircraft didn't mean that the aircraft was in flight. So while the results of the analysis were accurate, the interpretation of the results was misguided. This was actually published in the British Medical Journal as a joke. In fact, the authors themselves suggested and warned against extrapolating these high altitude jumps from their results. While we all may find this entertaining, I want you to think for a moment, could our own research fall victim to this type of misuse? Do we understand the difference between aggregate and disaggregate data? Are we aware of the data lineage between aggregate and disaggregate data? Do we have an appreciation for the risks and benefits related to our data sourcing options? And do we recognize the analysis factors that influence our sourcing decisions? These are some of the questions that I hope to answer in this presentation. Next slide. To prepare us to answer these questions, we'll start by establishing an analytic approach and examine how it shapes our data source choices. I'll then introduce the analytical dilemma that we all face and explain how this can compromise our analytics approach. Next, we'll establish a baseline definition for aggregate and disaggregate data and seek to understand their data lineage. We'll then build upon the baseline definitions and explore aggregate data challenges and the opportunity we have with looking to use disaggregate data. We'll close by outlining a path toward data democracy, and I'll propose some next steps to improve the quality of our analysis and mitigate misuse. Let's dig in. Next slide. When we set out to perform our analysis, we often start with an idea of what we want to study, but then we quickly jump to identifying data sources. This happens to all of us because data collection or identification of sources can be the most time-consuming. We don't realize in the rush to analysis that the analytical approach has a direct impact on the data we choose. It impacts the sample we collect, the statistical methods we use, and ultimately the quality of the analysis and our interpretation. The topic for this session is aggregate and disaggregate data. It's imperative we establish a baseline for how we'll approach analysis. It starts with defining our analytic intent. What population are we studying? What's our hypothesis? And what population characteristics are required to sufficiently analyze our population? And also, what are our desired outcomes? Only then can we effectively evaluate the data required for our analysis. We start by looking at existing sources and evaluating the degree to which they support our intent. Does the data replicate our desired population? Does the data contain the pertinent characteristics that we deem crucial to our analysis? And how does aggregated data support another researcher's objective? Next slide. I'm sorry, you can stay there, Devon. Once we've identified a potential data source, we also have to consider our sampling strategy. Does the data source represent more than the population we intend to study? And how does it impact the characteristics we choose to study? In asking these questions, we find ourselves disqualifying data sources that maybe previously showed promise. With our data source sampling strategy in hand, we move forward to choosing our statistical method. Will our analysis be adequately supported by the descriptive statistics alone? Or will our analysis require predictive and inferential statistics? If so, are the additional characteristics required overlooked by the previous research? Once again, potentially disqualifying our data source. And the final step is to outline how our analysis will be executed, interpreted, and operationalized. These are critical because they too can result in data gaps that disqualify our data source. So while the topic today is aggregate and disaggregate data, I hope I've elevated the importance of an analytic approach and the impact it can make on our data-related decisions. So I'm sure you're all thinking, we're talking about the real world here, and we don't have time to follow a prescriptive approach. I too face that same challenge, but why? Why can't we follow a prescriptive approach to optimize the quality of our analytics? And this is because we all face a common analytical dilemma. Next slide. The dilemma we face is finding a balance between good and simple. While we all want analysis to be good, meaning accurate, timely, and relevant, we generally face time and budget constraints that impact that research. As a result, we find ourselves pursuing a simple path that is fast, easy, and cheap. Balancing speed and simple is such a common dilemma that academic research is focused on this topic as well. In 2009, an article by Kopag, Smith, and Ostang, A Dilemma in Analytical Processes, dug a little bit deeper into this conflict. Go to the next slide. The authors here note that good analysis is precise, accurate, and objective, while simple analysis is cheap, quick, and practical. How we resolve this conflict shapes the choices we make when defining our hypothesis, identifying data sources, or conducting analysis and interpreting the results. They're quick to explain, however, that the balance between good and simple can be managed. They suggest that we first establish a clear objective. Rather than shaping our analysis around data that's already available, take the time to clearly define our research objective. I referred to this previously as our analytic intent. In other words, what are we setting out to study? Next, they suggest that we focus our research outcomes to be actionable. As we strive to balance good and simple, it's okay to sacrifice a degree of precision as long as our results are objective, transparent, and actionable. Actionable outcomes will allow us to introduce change and pursue our desired state. When our research outcomes are actionable, they naturally become less complex, and as a result, we're making our research sufficiently simple and understood so that it can be applied in practice. At the same time, we need to mitigate misuse, much like the parachute example, by making our analysis sufficiently detailed. This means we need to provide enough detail to enable our audience to climb the ladder of inference with us and follow our logic and gain confidence in our conclusion. Gaining confidence in our conclusion is why we begin to make the decision between aggregate and disaggregate data. If we choose the wrong source, we overly generalize or inappropriately extrapolate, we lose credibility of our audience. But effectively mitigating misuse requires a definitional review of aggregate and disaggregate data. Next slide. So here it is side by side. Disaggregate data are individual responses or observations before analysis has been applied. Notice that the data is in raw form. It'll need to be cleansed before it's subjected to our analysis. This could mean eliminating incomplete observations, categorizing pertinent characteristics, or indexing numeric data. On the other hand, aggregate data are not in their raw form. They're the result of analysis performed by another person. Generally speaking, the data was used for the purposes of that analysis, and it may mask key characteristics that impact our specific use case. The differences become more clear when we review the lineage. Next slide, please. This is not to say that using aggregate data is bad, but it's imperative that we understand how the lineage flows. This diagram has technical acumen on the y-axis and analytical acumen on the x-axis. In the lower right, you have data. Data is defined as things, events, and observations. In the context of the conference, we refer to disaggregate data or microdata. This data was collected based on another researcher's analytic intent for a population they chose to study. The data is in its raw form, such that each observation maintains its own unique identity within the data set. Through aggregation or data processing, the researcher transforms the data into information. The data is organized, it's tabulated, or summarized to provide insights relative to their analytic objective. We refer to this as data, but it's actually the results of their research. And we could argue that it's not data at all. Because aggregate data has been processed for another researcher's objective, the selection criteria, filters, tabulation logic, and are often not apparent and can lead to misuse and false interpretation. I've had this experience myself in a commercial setting. I was approached by a major airline about a failing product. The company was asked to requalify the part that was used, and it was used to control the wing flaps of an aircraft. The 20-year-old qualification report demonstrated that the product had met the original specification, and the analyst presented solid statistical evidence to support that qualification. The same report was then used years later to qualify the product for another aircraft. Unfortunately, the product began to fail, and I was asked to review the qualification report. What I found was that the first analyst had filtered out certain performance observations from the aggregate data and built their original qualification case around those summary statistics. Fortunately, I had access to the disaggregate data and was able to perform some statistical analysis on my own using the full set. What I found was that the part never actually qualified to be on the second aircraft, and the analyst misused the aggregate data from the original qualification report. In this example, the second analyst more heavily weighted the simple, and his results were quickly called into question. Not all reuse of aggregate data has a life-threatening impact, as my example, but it demonstrates how reuse of aggregate data can lead to misguided inference. This is not to say that aggregate data is without benefit, but it's about striking the right balance between good and simple. So what are the benefits of aggregate data? Next slide, please. The advantages of aggregate data all tend to lean toward the simple end of the spectrum. Accessibility. The aggregate data sources have access to legal or private data that we may not otherwise have access to. Availability. The sampling and data collection have already been done, and it reduces the data collection and processing time. It's easy. And then credibility. Our analysis can be built on research, and statistics that have already been published or accepted. We also can mitigate risk because we don't have to worry about inadvertently exposing personally identifiable data, a topic that's important to all of us. And lastly, it's about speed. The hard work's already been done, and we can jump right into the analysis and interpretation. While these benefits may be appealing, the risks, in my opinion, are far greater. Next slide, please. First and foremost, we have to remember that the aggregate data was assembled by another analyst. This means the aggregate data was purpose-built based on that analyst's objective. In building the aggregation, we need to recognize that the results were also fit for purpose. The analyst was building a story to support their argument, and we generally don't have visibility to the logic they imposed, the sampling methodology, or the selection criteria for inclusion in their final analysis. Because the aggregate data is fit for purpose, we're also subject to information loss. In other words, characteristics we feel that are pertinent to our analysis may be concealed and not provide us the opportunity to explore those differences. As a result, we're prone to making misguided inference by applying inappropriate extrapolation techniques. Ultimately, these misguided inferences lead to faulty conclusions that put our credibility and quality of analysis at risk. Let's take a look at some examples and how these play out in practice. Next slide. Let's start with an academic example that leads to faulty conclusions. Anscombe's quartet demonstrates how descriptive statistics, or aggregate data, don't always expose the underlying story within the data. In this example, we have 4 distinct data sets that each produce virtually the same descriptive statistics. They have the same mean, variance, correlation coefficient, and R-square values. Looking at these statistics, we would be led to believe that they represent the same population, when in fact, they have fundamentally different distributions. The scatter plot on the left exposes the distribution difference, while the descriptive statistics quantitatively represent the blue trend line in each of those charts. This is where we'd greatly benefit from having access to the disaggregate data rather than the aggregate data. Next slide, please. In example 2, concealed equality, the analyst concluded that the mathematical aptitude scores between men and women were substantially different. In fact, men's scores were much higher than women's scores. As you can imagine, this created tremendous debate and inspired further analysis. By further analyzing the disaggregate data, other important characteristics were exposed. In this case, it was found that the school the student attended was very important. Furthermore, males were enrolled in engineering more so, and those scores carried a higher weight in the mean calculation. By including the school in the analysis, the analyst was able to demonstrate that equality of males and females was concealed in the results. In fact, you'll notice that there's a great equality between male and female students who are in the same school. This example demonstrates how concealed characteristics of aggregate data could result in misguided inference. Next slide, please. The third example is one of concealed difference. This study was intended to evaluate the survival rate of 2 hospitals. The initial results in Table 2 suggest that Hospital A has a significantly higher number of deaths than Hospital B. What wasn't considered in the initial result, however, was the condition of the patient when they entered the hospital. The results tell a much different story when the patient's condition is exposed as another key characteristic. By introducing this condition, we learn a few things. First, the sample size for good condition patients is equal for both hospitals. Second, death outcomes for good condition patients are also relatively equal. Next, the sample size for bad condition patients is significantly higher for hospital A than hospital B. And last, the percentage of death outcomes relative to the sample sizes are equal. This example demonstrates how aggregate data can conceal differences and also result in misguided use. So how can we manage the risk inherent with aggregate data? Next slide, please. First, we need to understand the researcher's analytic intent. Only then can we truly appreciate what the data represents. We then need to investigate the population that was defined for the study. Next, we need to examine the sample sizes for each of the characteristics we deem pertinent to our research. We then need to explore how the study was constructed. We then need to avoid reacting or reaching overarching extrapolation. And then finally, pursue disaggregate data whenever possible. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The benefits of disaggregate data are alignment with analytic intent. I can match my data to the analysis I intend to produce. I can also gain exposure to the subcategories, gain visibility to characteristics that I find pertinent. I also have the ability to control the rules, grouping, and selection criteria for those observations I include in my research. By having the detailed data, I also have more statistical techniques and analytics and simulation available to me. My modeling options are less constrained. I then have the ability to tailor my sample to exactly what I'm studying. And ultimately, I have increased opportunity of reuse across the analysis community, meaning we can all share data. There are many challenges though, especially in the public sector. First, working with disaggregate data requires a greater technical acumen. Second, a more advanced tool set, which can be quite expensive. Apparently, or obviously, the data and privacy and security concerns. We have increased costs because we're storing more data and we're processing data. Awareness of the data collection and sampling methodology. Data quality and cleansing. If we get the data in the raw form, we have a lot of manipulation to do to position it for our particular analysis. And ultimately, we have slower delivery of analysis, interpretation, and outcomes. This is the balance between good and simple. So the path I see toward data democracy is very much like Dr. Buskirk suggested and Kendra noted. Establish a data clearinghouse or data hub, as Kendra mentioned. Anticipate reuse in our data collection. Don't collect our data specifically for our own purpose. Anticipate how others might want to use the data and include those characteristics in our data collection. Clearly define and share our analytic intent in the population definition for our study. Be transparent with data collection and sampling methodology so that folks can easily transpose the data for their use. And openly share disaggregate data. And lastly, work toward developing technical skills so that we can effectively capitalize on disaggregate data. So as Dr. Buskirk mentioned, we need to start sharing data. These are a few key steps that I find appropriate. First, start with a data focus workshop. Let's get all agencies in a room and talk about what data they're interested in and what are the key characteristics that they might want to collect and share. We'll take that information and develop a data catalog, and then we'll create a logical data model that represents all potential data sources across agencies. We can then use that data model to identify gaps where we need to focus on collecting additional data. Next, establish data collection standards so that when any of us go out and collect data, we're collecting the characteristics that are important across agencies. Next, initiate data collection initiatives that enhance our research objectives. What research do we want to do tomorrow? And let's start moving on collecting that data. And then finally, document so that data is easier to reuse across agencies.